The morning mist clung to Rabal's airstrip like death itself, and Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington knew something was terribly wrong the moment his F-4U Corsair's engine coughed. 28 enemy kills under his belt meant nothing now, not when his fuel gauge needle danced on empty and enemy Zeros swarmed the Pacific sky like angry hornets. But what he was about to witness in the next 17 minutes would haunt him for the rest of his life, long after the Japanese submarine crew pulled his broken body from the churning waters. Black Sheep Leader, this is base. Come in, over. The radio crackled with static, but Boyington's attention was locked on something else entirely, something that made his blood run cold. 3,000 feet below, on the seemingly abandoned Japanese airfield, he could see them clearly through his gun sight. American prisoners of war. Dozens of them. Lined up in perfect rows like toy soldiers, their hands bound behind their backs. The morning sun glinted off something metallic in a Japanese officer's hand. A sword. Sweet Mother of God, Boyington whispered into his oxygen mask, his knuckles white against the control stick. He'd seen enough executions in China with the Flying Tigers to know what was coming next. The systematic, ceremonial murder of his fellow Americans was about to begin, and he was the only witness 3 miles high in a dying aircraft. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was recognizing the face of the man kneeling at the front of the line, Lieutenant Tommy Morrison from VMF 122. The kid who'd written letters to his sweetheart Mary every single night. The same kid who'd shared his last chocolate bar with Boyington just 2 weeks ago in the mess tent. Tommy was supposed to be dead, officially listed as Kia after his Wildcat went down over Bougainville, except he wasn't dead. He was very much alive, and in exactly 30 seconds, he wouldn't be. Pappy, where the hell are you? The voice belonged to Captain John Indian McManus, his wingman, crackling through the radio with increasing urgency. We've got company coming in fast from the northeast. 8 zeros, maybe 10. Boyington's finger hovered over the radio transmit button, but his eyes remained fixed on the horrific scene unfolding below. The Japanese officer had raised his sword, the blade catching the morning light like a silver prayer. Tommy Morrison's shoulders were shaking, whether from fear or defiance, Boyington couldn't tell from this distance. What he could tell was that he had a choice to make: dive down and strafe the execution site, potentially saving some of the prisoners but guaranteeing his own death as his fuel-starved Corsair became a sitting duck for the approaching Zero Squadron. Or maintain altitude, preserve his ammunition and fuel, and live to fight another day while watching his fellow Americans die like animals in the dirt below. But as Boyington watched the Japanese officer's sword begin its deadly arc, something else caught his eye. Something that changed everything. A second group of prisoners, hidden behind a concrete bunker. These weren't just random captured airmen. These were the missing crew members from the USS Helena, the cruiser that had supposedly gone down with all hands 6 months ago. Captain Henderson, who'd taught Boyington poker during their brief shore leave in Sydney. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, whose wife had just given birth to twins. They were all supposed to be dead. Officially, tragically, heroically dead. Instead, they were kneeling in the Pacific mud, waiting for a Japanese blade to end their misery. Pappy. McManus's voice cut through his shock like a physical blow. Break left now. The first Zero's machine gun fire stitched across his starboard wing, sending aluminum fragments spinning through the cockpit like deadly confetti. Boyington yanked the stick hard left, his G-suit crushing his ribs as the Corsair screamed into a defensive spiral. But even as he fought for his life, his eyes kept drifting back to the airfield below. The Japanese officer had paused, his sword raised but motionless, looking up at the aerial combat developing overhead. Tommy Morrison had lifted his head too, and for one impossible moment, Boyington could swear their eyes met across 3,000 feet of empty air. What happened next would replay in Boyington's mind every single night for the next 18 months in Japanese captivity. The Zero pilot pursuing him made a critical error, banking too sharply in his eagerness for the kill. Boyington pulled his Corsair into a climbing turn that would have been impossible with full fuel tanks, but his near-empty bird responded like a dancer. The enemy fighter stalled, hung motionless for a heartbeat, and then fell away spinning toward the earth, directly toward the execution site. Boyington watched in horror as the disabled Zero, its pilot probably already dead from the violent spin, plummeted like a meteorite toward the airfield. The Japanese guards scattered like ants from a disturbed nest, dragging some prisoners with them and abandoning others. The Zero impacted 50 yards from where Tommy Morrison knelt, the explosion sending a tower of orange flame and black smoke into the morning sky. Through the chaos and fire, Boyington could see figures running, some in Japanese uniforms, some in tattered American fatigues. Some of his countrymen had just been handed a chance at escape by a dead enemy pilot's final, inadvertent gift, but not Tommy Morrison. The kid remained on his knees, perfectly still, directly in line with where the Japanese officer had resumed his position. The sword was moving again, and this time there would be no interruption. "Jesus, Pappy, you got him." McManus's voice was pure adrenaline and relief. "That was some flying, Major. Now let's get the hell out of here before his friends show up." Boyington's thumb found the radio transmit button, but no words came. "How do you explain to your wingman that you just watched an American serviceman executed by sword while you were dogfighting 3,000 feet overhead? How do you describe the moment when a man who's supposed to be dead looks up at you with acceptance in his eyes as a Japanese blade ends his suffering? How do you live with the knowledge that 12 other Americans just escaped into the jungle, and you're the only living soul who knows they're out there? Pappy. You copy?" "Roger, Indian," Boyington finally managed, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. "Let's head home." But even as he banked toward Henderson Field, Boyington knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. The smoke from the crashed Zero was dissipating, and he could see Japanese soldiers systematically hunting through the jungle at the airfield's perimeter. They had dogs. They had trucks. They had radios. The escaped prisoners wouldn't last an hour unless someone created a diversion. Boyington checked his fuel gauge one more time. Maybe 10 minutes of flight time remaining, probably less. His ammunition counter showed 180 rounds, enough for one good strafing run, maybe two if he was careful. McManus was already a mile ahead, following standard procedure for a fuel-critical return to base. Good. What Boyington was about to do violated every tactical manual ever written, and he wouldn't ask anyone else to die for his conscience. He rolled the Corsair inverted and pulled the nose down toward the airfield. The Japanese soldiers looked up in surprise as the blue F-4U screamed out of the morning sun at barely 50 feet, its 6.50 caliber machine guns hammering everything that moved. Boyington's first pass scattered the search teams and sent their dogs howling into the brush. His second pass, conducted at such low altitude that his prop wash bent the jungle grass flat, targeted the radio equipment and vehicles. On his third pass, with his fuel gauge deep in the red and black smoke pouring from his engine, Boyington saw something that made his heart stop. One of the escaped prisoners had doubled back. Instead of fleeing into the jungle with the others, he was dragging Tommy Morrison's body toward the tree line. The kid was heavy, the terrain was rough, and Japanese soldiers were converging from 3 directions, but the prisoner wasn't giving up. Even as machine gun fire kicked up dirt around his feet, even as his strength failed and he stumbled repeatedly, he kept dragging his fallen comrade toward whatever remained of freedom. Boyington recognized him now, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, the sailor whose wife had given birth to twins. The man who was supposed to be at the bottom of the Pacific with the rest of the Helena's crew. Rodriguez was going to die trying to save a dead Marine, and there wasn't a damn thing Boyington could do about it except watch. His engine chose that moment to quit entirely. The sudden silence was deafening. No more roar of the twin-row radial, no more whistle of air over wings. Just the sound of wind through the cockpit and his own breathing inside the oxygen mask. The Corsair was now a 14,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick. Boyington had perhaps 90 seconds before impact. He could try to stretch his glide toward Henderson Field, maybe make it within swimming distance of friendly territory. Or he could use his remaining altitude to give Rodriguez and the other escapees the cover they desperately needed. Looking down at the airfield one last time, Boyington made his choice. He pushed the nose down and aimed for the largest concentration of Japanese vehicles he could find. If he was going down, he'd take as many of the enemy with him as possible. But more importantly, He'd give 12 Americans the chance to disappear into the jungle while every Japanese soldier on the base was dealing with a crashed Corsair and its very angry pilot. The altimeter unwound like a broken clock. 3,000 feet. 2,000. 1,000. 800 feet. Boyington pulled out of his dive and leveled off, trading his remaining altitude for distance. His plan was simple: crash the Corsair into the motor pool at the far end of the airfield, as far from the escaped prisoners as possible. 400 feet. He saw Rodriguez finally reach the jungle edge, still dragging Tommy Morrison's body. Other figures moved through the trees, the rest of the escapees, helping their wounded shipmate find cover. 200 feet. Boyington's canopy was shot away by ground fire, the plexiglass exploding around him like frozen rain. Blood ran down his face from a dozen small cuts, but his hands remained steady on the controls. 100 feet. He realized he wasn't going to make it to the motor pool. His wounded Corsair was dropping too fast, bleeding airspeed and altitude with every passing second. He'd be lucky to clear the perimeter fence, much less reach the vehicle depot. But directly below him, perfectly positioned for impact, sat the radio building, the nerve center of Japanese communications for the entire base. If he could take out their command and control capability, it would buy the escapees hours of confusion and misdirection. It might even save their lives. Boyington aimed for the radio building and held his breath. The impact, when it came, was surprisingly gentle. One moment he was flying a damaged fighter aircraft at 200 miles per hour toward certain death. The next moment he was sitting in a pool of aviation fuel and twisted metal, watching Japanese soldiers surround his crash site with the detached interest of a man who has already died and is waiting for his body to catch up with the news. His left leg was bent at an impossible angle. His right arm hung useless at his side. Blood filled his mouth with the taste of copper pennies and defeat. But he was alive, which was more than he'd expected. 30 seconds ago, the first Japanese soldier to reach the wreckage pointed a rifle at Boyington's head and said something in rapid Japanese. The major didn't speak the language, but the meaning was clear enough: move and die. Boyington didn't move. He just sat there in the ruins of his aircraft, thinking about Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez and the other 11 men who were, with any luck, disappearing deeper into the jungle with every passing minute. He thought about Tommy Morrison, who died on his knees in Pacific mud while writing a mental letter to his sweetheart Mary. He thought about the sword blade catching the morning sun, and the way a dead Zero pilot had accidentally saved more American lives than most living heroes. Mostly, he thought about the secret he now carried, the knowledge that 12 men officially listed as killed in action were actually alive and fighting their way through hostile territory toward possible salvation. It was a secret the Japanese would spend the next 18 months trying to extract from him through methods that redefined his understanding of human cruelty. It was a secret he would protect with a stubborn silence that drove his captors to distraction and earned him beatings that left permanent scars on his body and soul. It was a secret that would sustain him through rice bowl meals and bamboo cages, through interrogations that lasted for days and solitary confinement that stretched for weeks. Because no matter what they did to him, no matter how much pain they inflicted or how many times they broke his bones, Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington would always know that his last combat mission had saved 12 American lives. Even if nobody else ever learned the truth, the Japanese officer approaching his crash site was young, probably fresh from the military academy, with the kind of pristine uniform that marked him as someone who'd never seen real combat. He spoke surprisingly good English, with a British accent that suggested education in London before the war. "You are Major Boyington," the officer said, consulting a small notebook. "The famous Black Sheep commander. We have been expecting you." Boyington said nothing. Blood continued to drip from his head wounds onto the twisted metal of his instrument panel. "I am Lieutenant Yamamoto," the officer continued. "I will be conducting your initial interrogation. You shot down 28 of our aircraft, killed many of our pilots. This makes you a valuable prisoner, but also a dangerous enemy." Still silence from Boyington. "We know you saw something during your final attack run," Yamamoto said, leaning closer. "Something that made you sacrifice your aircraft and your freedom. We know about the escaped prisoners, Major. We know you diverted your attack to provide them with cover. For the first time since the crash, Boyington felt genuine fear. Not for himself, he'd made peace with his own death the moment he'd pointed his Corsair at the radio building. But for Rodriguez and the others, who might be betrayed by his own broken body and exhausted mind. "We will find them," Yamamoto continued conversationally. "The jungle is large, but not infinite. Our tracker teams are already in pursuit. But you could save us time, Major. And perhaps save yourself considerable unpleasantness." Boyington found his voice at last. "Go to hell." Lieutenant Yamamoto smiled sadly, as if he'd expected exactly that response. "I was afraid you would say that, Major. You Americans have such a romantic view of heroism. But I think 18 months in our custody will adjust your perspective considerably." 2 soldiers hauled Boyington from the wreckage, ignoring his broken bones and torn flesh. The pain was extraordinary, like being struck by lightning while drowning in fire. But he bit his tongue to keep from screaming, because he could see Japanese search teams forming up at the edge of the jungle, bloodhounds strained against their leashes, eager to follow the scent trail left by the escaped prisoners. Radio operators tested their equipment, coordinating the manhunt across dozens of frequencies. Officers studied maps and issued orders with the efficient brutality of men who had performed this particular dance many times before. The Japanese military machine was mobilizing to recapture 12 men who were supposed to already be dead. As they dragged him toward a waiting truck, Boyington caught sight of something that made his heart sink. Fresh boot prints in the mud near the jungle edge. Deep impressions that suggested a heavy burden, exactly what you'd expect from a man carrying a dead comrade through difficult terrain. Rodriguez had left a trail that any competent tracker could follow with his eyes closed. The escaped prisoners had maybe a 4-hour head start, but they were injured, exhausted, and burdened with Tommy Morrison's body. The Japanese pursuers were fresh, well-equipped, and motivated by the promise of severe punishment if they failed to recapture their quarry. It would be a massacre. Unless Boyington could give the hunters something else to think about. "Lieutenant," he called out as they reached the truck. "That interrogation you mentioned. When do we start?" Yamamoto looked surprised by the question. "Immediately, I should think." "Why?" "Because I've got information about American submarine positions that will interest your intelligence officers. Recent patrol routes, communication frequencies, the works." Boyington let desperation creep into his voice, as if he were already breaking under pressure. "I'll trade it for medical attention and decent food." It was all lies, of course. Boyington knew nothing about submarine operations that wasn't already common knowledge. But if he could convince the Japanese that he possessed valuable intelligence, they might call off the manhunt in favor of immediate interrogation. Yamamoto's eyes gleamed with the fervor of a man who saw promotion in his immediate future. "Sergeant," he barked in Japanese. "Radio the search teams. Tell them to establish a perimeter but not to pursue. We have more important business to attend to." The bloodhounds whined in frustration as their handlers pulled them back from the jungle edge. Radio chatter filled the air as search teams received new orders. Officers who had been preparing for a manhunt suddenly found themselves reassigned to security duty. Boyington allowed himself a small smile as the truck engine coughed to life. His deception had bought Rodriguez and the others perhaps 12 hours of breathing room. Maybe long enough to reach the coast, or find a cave system deep enough to hide in until the search was called off. "The submarine information, Major. I'm waiting." Boyington met the lieutenant's gaze and spoke his first words of the day. "I lied." The pen stopped tapping. "I beg your pardon. I lied about the submarines. I don't know anything about patrol routes or frequencies. I just wanted to delay your search teams long enough for those prisoners to get a head start." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ceiling fan's lazy rotation and that persistent screaming from the building next door. Yamamoto's face remained perfectly composed, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "I see," he said finally. "And how did that work out for you, Major?" The question hit Boyington like a physical blow. Because the honest answer was that he didn't know. 12 hours had passed since his crash, and he had no idea whether Rodriguez and the others were still alive, still free, or already back in Japanese custody. His sacrifice might have saved them. Or it might have been completely pointless, but he'd never know, because admitting he cared about their fate would confirm everything Yamamoto suspected. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Boyington said. Yamamoto smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Major, we've already recaptured 3 of the escaped prisoners. They were hiding in a cave system approximately 8 kilometers from the airfield. My tracker teams found them this morning." The words hit Boyington like machine gun fire, each syllable tearing through his carefully constructed emotional armor. 3 men. 3 of the 12 who had escaped during the confusion of his crash. 3 men who were supposed to be dead but had briefly tasted freedom before being dragged back into hell, but that meant 9 were still out there. 9 men who might still make it to Allied lines, still carried the truth about Japanese war crimes back to the world. If Yamamoto was telling the truth, Yamamoto leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the psychological chess match. Rodriguez also mentioned something quite interesting about Lieutenant Morrison's final moments. Apparently, the young Marine was carrying something when he was captured. A small leather portfolio that he refused to surrender, even under torture. Boyington's heart stopped. Tommy Morrison had been the squadron's intelligence officer. If he'd been carrying classified documents when he was shot down, if those documents had survived his capture and execution, the portfolio contained reconnaissance photographs. Yamamoto continued, watching Boyington's face carefully. Images of Japanese installations throughout the Solomon Islands, taken during recent bombing missions. But more importantly, it contained a complete roster of American personnel officially listed as missing in action but suspected of being held in Japanese custody. The implications hit Boyington like a tsunami. Morrison hadn't just been another pilot shot down in combat. He'd been carrying evidence of systematic Japanese violations of international law, proof that enemy forces were concealing the capture of Allied personnel, executing prisoners in violation of the Geneva Convention, and lying to the Red Cross about the fate of American servicemen. Morrison had died protecting that evidence, and now the Japanese had it. 312 names, Major, Yamamoto said softly. 312 American servicemen whose families believe them to be dead but who are actually imprisoned in facilities like this one. Your Lieutenant Morrison was apparently compiling evidence of what you Americans would call war crimes. Rodriguez was shaking his head again, his eyes pleading with Boyington to remain silent. The chief petty officer understood the trap that was closing around them both. If Boyington admitted knowledge of Morrison's intelligence mission, he would confirm his own value as a prisoner. The Japanese would keep him alive indefinitely, extracting every scrap of information about American reconnaissance operations, pilot identities, and military intelligence procedures. But if he continued to deny everything, Rodriguez and the other recaptured prisoners would pay the price for his silence. "Where are the other 2 prisoners you recaptured?" Boyington asked. Yamamoto's smile widened. "An excellent question, Major. Would you like to see them?" Before Boyington could answer, the door opened again. This time, the guards carried in a stretcher bearing what had once been a human being. The figure was unconscious, breathing in shallow gasps that indicated severe internal injuries. Both legs were clearly broken, and the left side of his skull was crushed in a way that suggested he wouldn't survive much longer. But Boyington recognized the dog tags hanging around the dying man's neck. Seaman First Class William Billy Patterson from the USS Helena. 20 years old, from a farm in Iowa. He'd shown Boyington pictures of his high school sweetheart during their brief meeting at the Sydney USO Club. A kid who'd lied about his age to enlist after Pearl Harbor, desperate to serve his country and make his family proud. Now he was dying on a bamboo stretcher in a Japanese interrogation room, his young life draining away one labored breath at a time. Patterson lasted 18 hours under questioning, Yamamoto said conversationally. Quite remarkable for someone so young. Unfortunately, he proved somewhat fragile under physical stress. Boyington wanted to kill the Japanese lieutenant with his bare hands. wanted to wrap his fingers around that cultured throat and squeeze until those cold eyes bulged out of their sockets. But he forced himself to remain motionless, to show no emotion that might betray his connection to the dying sailor. The third prisoner was even less cooperative, Yamamoto continued. Petty Officer Second Class Robert Chen. Chinese American, as his name suggests. He seemed to believe that his ethnic heritage would afford him some protection under interrogation. The door opened a third time. Yamamoto made another note in his book, his pen scratching across the paper with mechanical precision. Very well, Major. I had hoped we could resolve this matter quickly and humanely. But if you prefer the extended approach, Chen was too far gone to acknowledge anything, his consciousness flickering like a candle in a strong wind. And Patterson, the boy, died while we were talking, Yamamoto observed clinically. Internal bleeding, most likely. A pity, he had such an honest face. The weight of that sacrifice was going to crush him if he let it. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Boyington alone with his broken body and his unbreakable secret. It wasn't just about 12 escaped prisoners or 47 survivors from the Helena. It wasn't even about Tommy Morrison's intelligence portfolio or the systematic execution of American servicemen. And Boyington was the only person in Allied custody who knew the truth. How long before the Japanese broke him down completely and extracted every detail about American intelligence operations, pilot training procedures, and military communications protocols, as darkness fell over the prison compound for the second time since his capture? Major Gregory Pappy Boyington closed his eyes and began to count. If the war lasted that long. If he lasted that long. If the 9 men still hiding in the jungle could somehow make it to Allied lines with the truth about Japanese atrocities. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Boyington kept his expression neutral, but his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. 18 hours had passed since his last interrogation. 18 hours for the Japanese tracker teams to close in on Rodriguez's remaining comrades. 15 kilometers. The escapees had covered impressive ground in difficult terrain while carrying wounded men and avoiding pursuit. But 15 kilometers wasn't far enough, not nearly far enough to reach safety. 6 hours. That meant the escapees were still running, still fighting for their lives somewhere in the jungle. Still carrying the truth about 312 missing American servicemen. However, my men did find something quite interesting in the abandoned camp. Something that belonged to your deceased Lieutenant Morrison. The leather portfolio you mentioned yesterday. Of course you didn't, Major. My mistake. Yamamoto smiled coldly. The portfolio containing Morrison's reconnaissance photographs and personnel roster. It seems our escaped prisoners managed to retrieve it from the execution site before fleeing into the jungle. If they made it to Allied lines, the information could save hundreds of lives and expose years of Japanese atrocities. If they were recaptured, the intelligence would disappear forever, and 312 American families would never learn the truth about their loved ones. I'm beginning to think, Major, that your crashed aircraft was not the random accident it appeared to be. I'm beginning to think that you deliberately sacrificed yourself to ensure the success of an intelligence operation that extends far beyond a simple prisoner escape. I think Lieutenant Morrison was more than just another fighter pilot, Yamamoto pressed. I think he was an intelligence officer conducting systematic reconnaissance of Japanese prisoner facilities. I think his aircraft was shot down while he was documenting evidence of our treatment of captured American personnel. And I think you, Major Boyington, were his contact. His superior officer. The men responsible for coordinating intelligence gathering operations throughout your squadron. And Boyington had been aware of Morrison's activities, had even provided unofficial support in the form of patrol routes that passed near suspected prison sites. They would break him eventually. Everyone broke eventually. And when they did, the cost in Allied lives would be catastrophic. Then explain this, Yamamoto said, producing a small object from his pocket. We found this in Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez's possession when he was recaptured, Yamamoto explained. Morrison must have given it to him just before his execution, along with instructions about the intelligence operation they were both involved in. A network that the Japanese were now systematically dismantling. Rodriguez was dead. The chief petty officer who had risked everything to drag Tommy Morrison's body to safety, who had survived the sinking of the Helena only to be tortured to death in a Japanese prison camp, was gone. According to Rodriguez, Morrison was carrying more than just reconnaissance photographs and personnel rosters. He was carrying communication frequencies, safe house locations, and contact procedures for an underground network of Allied sympathizers operating throughout the Solomon Islands. And if the Japanese had recovered any of that information, dozens of local civilians, executed for the crime of helping Allied personnel. Their blood was on Morrison's hands, and by extension, on Boyington's hands as well. Chen was dead too. The Chinese-American sailor who had endured systematic torture rather than betray his fellow escapees was gone. 3 men down, 9 still running through the jungle with intelligence that could change the war. "I'm going to make you an offer, Major," Yamamoto said. "A one-time opportunity to save what remains of your intelligence network and the lives of the men still carrying Morrison's information. Tell me everything you know about Morrison's intelligence activities. Provide me with the names and locations of his contacts within your squadron. Give me the communication procedures and safe house protocols that your network has been using. In exchange, I will personally guarantee that the 9 remaining escapees will be treated as prisoners of war rather than intelligence operatives when they are recaptured. No interrogation. No torture. No execution. They will be transferred to a standard POW facility and held according to Geneva Convention protocols." But it was also a lie. "I don't know anything about intelligence networks," Boyington said. He stood up and walked to the door, then turned back for one final comment. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through Boyington's bones. 24 hours for Boyington to decide whether his silence was worth 9 more deaths. As the guards dragged him back to his bamboo cage, Major Gregory, Pappy, Boyington closed his eyes and tried to calculate distances in his head. 15 kilometers from the airfield to the abandoned cave complex. Another unknown distance to wherever the escapees were hiding now. How far to the nearest Allied position? How far to safety? But sometimes impossible distances could be covered by men with impossible determination. Sometimes the truth was worth any sacrifice. The sound that woke Boyington from his restless sleep wasn't the usual morning routine of guard changes and prisoner movements. It was the unmistakable roar of aircraft engines, American aircraft engines, passing low over the prison compound in the pre-dawn darkness. F4U Corsairs, by the sound of them. At least 4, maybe 6, flying in tight formation just above the jungle canopy. The distinctive growl of their twin-row radial engines was like a hymn of hope in the suffocating despair of the bamboo cage. A rescue mission. Or just routine patrol, unknowingly passing over a prison camp that didn't exist on any Allied intelligence map. Good. Listen carefully, because I can only say this once. Those Corsairs weren't on patrol. They were providing cover for an extraction team. "We're here to get you out." The words were so impossible, so beyond hope, that Boyington wondered if he was hallucinating from fever and exhaustion. Rescue operations didn't happen this deep in Japanese territory. The risks were too great, the chances of success too small, but the voice continued, urgent and real. "My name is Captain Jake Sullivan, Marine Force Reconnaissance. We've been tracking the 9 escapees for the past 36 hours, and they've provided us with intelligence that changes everything. The information they're carrying is more important than anyone realized." Sullivan paused, listening for approaching guards. "We know about Morrison's portfolio. We know about the 312 missing personnel. And we know you've been protecting that information at the cost of your own life." Boyington wanted to speak, wanted to ask a dozen questions about the escapees and their intelligence and the impossibility of a rescue mission this far behind enemy lines. But he forced himself to remain silent, trusting that Sullivan would provide the answers he needed. "Here's what's going to happen," Sullivan continued. "In approximately 20 minutes, our demolition team is going to create a diversion at the main gate. While the guards are responding to that threat, my extraction team will breach the rear fence and reach your position. It sounded like suicide. The prison compound was heavily guarded, surrounded by multiple layers of defensive positions, and located 15 kilometers from the nearest Allied lines. Even if the rescue team could reach Boyington's cage, how would they escape with a prisoner who could barely walk? "Major, I need you to understand something," Sullivan said, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "This isn't just about rescuing one pilot. The intelligence Morrison gathered, the information those 9 escapees are carrying, it's bigger than a few hundred missing prisoners. It's evidence of systematic war crimes that could change international law and prevent future atrocities." Sullivan's words carried the weight of absolute conviction. Morrison wasn't just documenting prisoner mistreatment. He was uncovering a deliberate policy of concealment that extends to the highest levels of Japanese command. Families are being lied to about their loved ones' deaths. The Red Cross is being systematically deceived. International observers are being shown fabricated evidence. The scope of what Sullivan was describing was staggering. Not just individual acts of cruelty, but an organized campaign to hide war crimes from the international community. A conspiracy that involved falsified casualty reports, forged death certificates, and carefully orchestrated deception. "We can't let that happen, Major. Too many lives depend on the secrets you're protecting." There was something in Sullivan's tone that made Boyington's blood run cold. Something that suggested this rescue mission might not be what it appeared to be. "Captain," Boyington whispered, finally breaking his silence. "What aren't you telling me?" For a long moment, Sullivan didn't respond. The footsteps had stopped somewhere nearby, and Boyington could hear hushed conversation in Japanese between 2 guards conducting their midnight rounds. When Sullivan spoke again, his voice carried a weight of regret that confirmed Boyington's worst fears. "Major, if we can't extract you safely, if the mission is compromised, then my orders are to ensure that you don't fall back into Japanese hands alive." The words hit Boyington like a physical blow. This wasn't a rescue mission, it was an assassination disguised as extraction. The Allied command had decided that his death was preferable to the risk of him being broken under torture. They were going to save him by killing him. "How many men did you bring?" Boyington asked. 12. Marine Force Recon, Special Operations. The best we have. 12 men were going to die attempting to rescue him, or attempting to kill him if rescue proved impossible. 12 Marines who would never see their families again, sacrificing their lives to protect intelligence networks that might not even exist anymore. "Captain, you need to abort this mission." "That's not an option, Major." "Listen to me," Boyington hissed urgently. "The intelligence Morrison gathered, the information about missing prisoners, the Japanese already have most of it. They've been interrogating captured escapees for days. Whatever secrets you're trying to protect, they're probably already compromised." Sullivan's silence stretched long enough to suggest he was reconsidering his orders. "Major, are you telling me that you've already broken under interrogation?" "No. I'm telling you that other people have. Good people who held out as long as they could before the torture became unbearable. This rescue mission is based on faulty intelligence. Then why are the Japanese still questioning you?" It was a fair question, and Boyington didn't have a good answer. If the enemy already possessed Morrison's intelligence files, if they'd successfully extracted operational details from captured escapees, then why continue the systematic interrogation of one broken pilot? If the Japanese believed he possessed current submarine patrol routes and communication frequencies, they would never stop trying to extract that information. They would keep him alive indefinitely, subjecting him to increasingly brutal interrogation methods until his mind finally shattered completely, and when it did, when they finally broke through his defenses and accessed the operational intelligence locked in his memory, the cost in Allied lives would be catastrophic. "Captain," Boyington whispered, "the mission is justified. But you need to know, if extraction becomes impossible, if your orders require you to eliminate me rather than let me fall back into enemy hands, I understand. I won't resist." Sullivan's response was immediate and firm. "That's not going to happen, Major. "We're getting you out of here alive." But even as he spoke those words, the sound of distant explosions echoed across the prison compound. The diversion at the main gate had begun, and somewhere in the darkness, 12 Marines were launching an operation that would either save Boyington's life or end it. The explosions grew louder, more frequent. Searchlights swept across the compound as guards responded to what they believed was a direct assault on the prison's primary entrance. Sirens wailed, officers shouted orders, and the entire facility erupted into controlled chaos. "Major, we're moving in 60 seconds, Sullivan said. "When I give the signal, I need you to move to the far corner of your cage and cover your head. We're going to blow the lock. 60 seconds to prepare for freedom or death. 60 seconds to say goodbye to the bamboo cage that had been his home for the past 48 hours. 60 seconds to make peace with whatever fate awaited him in the jungle darkness." But as Boyington shifted position within his cage, something caught his eye. A figure moving through the shadows between buildings, too far away to identify but clearly heading toward his position. Not wearing the familiar uniform of a Japanese guard, but moving with the fluid precision of someone trained in stealth operations. One of Sullivan's Marines, perhaps. Or a Japanese counterintelligence operative who had detected the rescue team's infiltration. "Captain," Boyington whispered. "Someone's coming." Sullivan's response was tense but controlled. "Japanese or American?" "Can't tell. Moving from the northwest, approximately 100 meters out." "Can't tell. At least a dozen, maybe more." Sullivan's curse was barely audible but exceptionally creative. "Major, change of plans. We're going to have to do this the hard way." Before Boyington could ask what that meant, the night exploded into chaos. The first Marine reached his cage just as Japanese soldiers emerged from concealment positions throughout the compound. The enemy had known about the rescue mission all along, had allowed the infiltration to proceed as planned, and were now springing their own trap. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies as the Marines fought desperately to reach their objective. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the bamboo buildings, punctuated by the sharper crack of rifle shots and the occasional boom of grenades. The Marine at Boyington's cage was working frantically to place demolition charges on the lock mechanism, his hand steady despite the bullets whining overhead. Young face, probably not yet 25, with the kind of focused determination that came from extensive training and absolute commitment to the mission. "Sir," the Marine said without looking up from his work. "Corporal Martinez, 2nd Force Recon Company. We're going to get you out of here." A bullet punched through the bamboo wall 6 inches from Martinez's head, but he didn't even flinch. Just continued his work with the methodical precision of someone who had practiced this exact scenario dozens of times. "Corporal, this compound is surrounded. How are you planning to extract?" "Submarine pickup at grid reference 774, approximately 2 clicks southeast. USS Nautilus is standing by for emergency evacuation." A submarine extraction. That explained how 12 Marines had managed to infiltrate so deep into enemy territory without being detected. The Nautilus must have surfaced just long enough to deploy the rescue team via inflatable boats, then submerged to wait for the extraction signal. But 2 kilometers through hostile jungle, carrying a prisoner who could barely walk, while being pursued by an entire garrison of enemy soldiers. The mission was still borderline suicidal. "Charges set," Martinez announced. "Fire in the hole." "Major Boyington," Yamamoto said pleasantly. "I was wondering when you would attempt something like this." Martinez's carbine was already swinging toward the Japanese position, but 6 rifles were faster than 1. The Marine managed to get off a single shot before enemy fire cut him down, his young body crumpling to the ground like a discarded uniform. "Corporal Martinez, wasn't it?" Yamamoto said, glancing at the dead Marine with casual interest. "2nd Force Reconnaissance Company, based on his unit markings. We've been monitoring their radio traffic for the past 6 hours." Boyington knelt beside Martinez's body, checking for signs of life he knew he wouldn't find. The young Marine had died instantly, probably never knew what hit him. Another life sacrificed to protect secrets that might not even matter anymore. The submarine extraction was an interesting touch, Yamamoto continued. USS Nautilus, if our intelligence is correct. Nuclear-powered, capable of remaining submerged for weeks at a time. Your command must consider you extremely valuable to risk such an asset. Boyington said nothing. There was nothing to say. The rescue mission had failed, Martinez was dead, and in a few minutes he would be back in his bamboo cage, facing interrogation techniques that would make the past few days seem pleasant by comparison. Stand up, Major, Yamamoto ordered. Slowly, with your hands visible. Boyington complied, his broken leg nearly giving out as he rose to his feet. The compound was quieter now, either the Marines were dead or they had withdrawn to regroup. Either way, the extraction was over. I'm curious about something, Yamamoto said as his soldiers took positions around their prisoners. How did your rescue team locate this facility? This compound doesn't appear on any Allied intelligence maps. We've taken considerable care to ensure it remains invisible to aerial reconnaissance. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Boyington could lie, could claim ignorance about intelligence procedures and operational planning. But Yamamoto would see through any deception, and the lie would only make his eventual interrogation more brutal. Or he could tell the truth, that the 9 escapees had provided detailed information about the compound's location, layout, and security procedures. Information they had gathered during their brief captivity before making their successful escape, the truth that would confirm everything Yamamoto suspected about Morrison's intelligence network and Boyington's role in coordinating reconnaissance operations. The escapees, Boyington said simply. Ah. Yamamoto smiled with the satisfaction of a man whose theories had just been confirmed. Yes, that makes sense. They would have had ample opportunity to observe our security procedures during their brief stay here. The lieutenant paused, considering the implications. Which means your Allied command now possesses detailed intelligence about this facility and others like it throughout the Solomon Islands. They know about our prisoner concealment operations, our violation of Geneva Convention protocols, our systematic deception of international observers. Yamamoto's smile widened. And they sent 12 Marines to their deaths attempting to rescue you because they believe you possess even more valuable intelligence. Operational details that could compromise their ongoing missions if extracted under interrogation. It was all true, and they both knew it. Boyington's capture was a catastrophe waiting to happen, and the failed rescue mission had only made the situation worse. Now the Japanese knew beyond doubt that he possessed intelligence worth risking a nuclear submarine to protect. They would never stop trying to extract it. Take him back to his cage, Yamamoto ordered his soldiers. Double the guard and inform the medical staff that we'll need him kept alive indefinitely. However long it takes. As the guards dragged him back toward his bamboo prison, Boyington caught sight of other figures in the compound. Bodies in marine fatigues, sprawled in the unnatural positions of violent death. The entire rescue team had been wiped out, 12 of America's finest soldiers sacrificed in a mission that had been doomed from the start, because the Japanese had known they were coming, because someone had betrayed the operation, because the intelligence war was more complex and deadly than anyone had imagined. The cage door slammed shut behind him with renewed finality, but this time Boyington wasn't alone with his thoughts. This time, he had the knowledge that 12 Marines had died attempting to save his life, and that their sacrifice had been meaningless, worse than meaningless, counterproductive. The failed rescue had confirmed everything the Japanese suspected about his intelligence value, ensuring that his interrogation would continue until his mind finally shattered under the pressure. But as he lay back against the bamboo walls and tried to find a position that didn't aggravate his injuries, Boyington realized something that changed everything. The rescue mission hadn't been a complete failure, because during the firefight, during the chaos and confusion of the Marines' assault, something had happened that Yamamoto didn't know about yet, something that gave Boyington one last card to play in the deadly game of intelligence and counterintelligence that was consuming the Pacific Warpoint. One of the Marines had made it to the perimeter fence. Boyington had seen him during the retreat, a figure in combat fatigue sprinting through the darkness toward the jungle edge. Whether the Marine had been wounded, Whether he was carrying intelligence about the compound's layout and security procedures, whether he would make it back to Allied lines, those were unknowns, but the possibility existed. The slim chance that one man might escape to tell the world about what he'd witnessed in this hidden corner of hell.it was enough to sustain hope for another day. Maybe even enough to sustain silence for another 18 months. If that's what it took to protect the 312 names on Morrison's list. If that's what it cost to ensure that the truth about Japanese war crimes eventually reached the international community. If that's the price of honor in a war where honor had become the scarcest commodity of all. The next morning brought Lieutenant Yamamoto and a new set of questions that cut closer to the bone than anything he'd asked before. "Major," the Japanese officer began, settling into his chair with the familiar comfort of routine. "I've received some interesting reports from our pursuit teams regarding last night's rescue attempt." Boyington kept his expression neutral, but his pulse quickened. If the Japanese had recaptured the escaped Marine, if they'd extracted information about Allied submarine operations or extraction procedures, then the intelligence disaster was even worse than he'd feared. "It seems one of your Marines managed to reach the perimeter fence before being shot," Yamamoto continued, consulting his ever-present notebook. He was carrying radio equipment and detailed maps of this facility. Quite thorough reconnaissance for such a brief infiltration. Shot, not captured. That was something, at least. A dead Marine couldn't be interrogated, couldn't be forced to reveal operational secrets or communication procedures. "Unfortunately for us, he transmitted a brief message before succumbing to his wounds," Yamamoto said, his tone suggesting that this development was anything but unfortunate from his perspective. "A coded burst transmission that our radio operators were unable to intercept in its entirety. A transmission. The escaped Marine had managed to send intelligence back to Allied command before dying at the perimeter fence. Information about the compound's location, its prisoner population, its security procedures, all of it now in the hands of people who could act on it. The transmission was brief, perhaps 30 seconds, but that would be sufficient to relay significant operational intelligence," Yamamoto observed. "Grid coordinates, facility layout, guard rotations. Enough information to plan a much more effective rescue operation." Boyington felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. If Allied command believed he was still alive and still possessed valuable intelligence, they might attempt another rescue mission. And this time, they would come in force. A company of Marines instead of a squad. Close air support instead of stealth infiltration. A full-scale assault that would turn the prison compound into a battlefield and guarantee the deaths of every American prisoner held there. "I've been authorized to offer you a final opportunity for cooperation," Yamamoto said. "Complete disclosure of your intelligence operations in exchange for transfer to a standard prisoner of war facility. No more interrogation. No more torture. Just containment until the war ends." It was a tempting offer, especially considering what Boyington now knew about Allied rescue plans. If he could convince Yamamoto that he'd revealed everything of value, the Japanese might move him to a conventional POW camp where he'd be relatively safe from both enemy interrogation and friendly fire, but it was also a test. Yamamoto was gauging his reaction to the threat of another rescue attempt, looking for signs that Boyington possessed intelligence worth the risk of a major military operation. "I've told you everything I know," Boyington said. "Have you, Major?" "Because our intelligence analysts believe otherwise. They believe you possess detailed knowledge of Allied submarine operations, communication protocols, and intelligence networks throughout the Pacific theater." Yamamoto leaned forward, his eyes bright with the intensity of a hunter closing in on his prey. "They believe you know the locations of fuel depots, ammunition caches, and forward operating bases that could change the course of this war if compromised. They believe you carry in your head the operational secrets that could save thousands of Japanese lives." The lieutenant paused to let that information sink in. "And based on last night's rescue attempt, it appears your own command agrees with that assessment." It was true, and they both knew it. Boyington did possess operational intelligence that could compromise ongoing Allied missions. Submarine patrol routes he'd observed during transport flights. communication frequencies he'd memorized during briefings, safe house locations and contact procedures that he'd learned through Morrison's informal intelligence network, information that was scattered, incomplete, and probably outdated, but potentially valuable enough to justify the risks his command was taking to either rescue or eliminate him. "Major, I'm going to ask you one final time," Yamamoto said. "Will you cooperate with our intelligence requirements?" Boyington met the lieutenant's gaze and gave the same answer he'd been giving for 3 days. "I don't know anything about intelligence operations." Yamamoto closed his notebook with a sharp snap and stood to leave. "Very well, Major. I had hoped we could resolve this matter through negotiation. But since you prefer more direct methods of persuasion," he walked to the door, then turned back for one last comment. "The next Allied rescue attempt will arrive tomorrow night. When it does, we'll be ready. And when your Marines are all dead and you're still sitting in that cage, perhaps you'll reconsider the value of stubborn silence." The door closed behind him, leaving Boyington alone with the knowledge that 24 hours remained before the compound became a killing field. 24 hours to decide whether his secrets were worth the lives of however many Marines were coming to save him. 24 hours to choose between personal honor and collective survival. 24 hours to prepare for the moment when silence stopped being heroic and started being selfish. As the tropical sun climbed toward its zenith, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington closed his eyes and began to count down the hours until his final test of courage, the test that would determine whether he died a hero or lived as a traitor, the test that would decide the fate of 312 American families who might never learn the truth about their loved ones. The test that would prove whether honor could survive in a place where honor went to die. 23 hours and 17 minutes later, the sound that had haunted Boyington's dreams became reality again. American aircraft engines, but this time not the familiar growl of Corsairs. This was the deeper, more ominous rumble of transport planes, C-47s carrying paratroopers, flying low and fast toward the prison compound, not a rescue mission. An invasion. Allied command had decided that Boyington's intelligence was too valuable to leave in enemy hands and too dangerous to extract through conventional means. They were going to level the entire compound and everyone in it, ensuring that whatever secrets he carried died with him. "Major Boyington." Lieutenant Yamamoto's voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness as he ran toward the cage, his usual composure completely shattered. "Your people are going to kill us all." The irony wasn't lost on Boyington. After 3 days of refusing to cooperate with Japanese interrogation, he was about to be murdered by his own countrymen to prevent exactly that cooperation. "How many planes?" Boyington asked. 12 transports, probably 200 paratroopers. Plus fighter escort." Yamamoto was unlocking the cage with hands that shook from desperation rather than cold. "They'll drop napalm first, then land assault troops to finish whatever survives." The Japanese officer hauled Boyington from his bamboo prison with surprising gentleness, as if his former torture victim had suddenly become a precious ally. "Major, I need you to understand something. This facility holds 47 American prisoners. If your forces proceed with this assault, every single one of them will die. My orders are to execute all prisoners rather than allow them to be rescued." 47 Americans. Not just the Helena survivors, but men from other ships and squadrons who had been secretly held in violation of Geneva Convention protocols. 47 families who believed their loved ones were dead but might still have a chance to see them again. If the assault could be stopped. "What do you want from me?" Boyington asked. "Radio contact with your command. Tell them you're cooperating fully, that the intelligence value has been compromised, that the assault is unnecessary." Yamamoto's voice was tight with controlled panic. "Tell them whatever you have to tell them to call off this attack." It was the perfect trap. Cooperate with the enemy to save American lives, but in doing so, confirm that he possessed valuable intelligence worth extracting. Yamamoto would get his information eventually, just through negotiation rather than torture, but 47 lives hung in the balance, and then Boyington realized something that changed everything. "Lieutenant, how do you know so much about this incoming assault? How do you know there are 12 transports and 200 paratroopers? Yamamoto's expression flickered, just for an instant, but long enough to confirm Boyington's suspicions. We intercepted radio communications. No, Boyington said quietly. You've got someone inside Allied Command. Someone who's been feeding you intelligence about rescue operations, submarine positions, operational planning. That's how you knew about last night's Marine infiltration. That's how you know about this assault. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Who is it? Boyington pressed. Who's been betraying American operations to save their own skin? Yamamoto's response was barely a whisper. Captain Henderson. The name hit Boyington like lightning. Captain Charles Henderson, Senior Intelligence Officer at Henderson Field. The man who had briefed him on Morrison's reconnaissance activities. The man who knew about submarine patrol routes, communication frequencies, and operational planning throughout the Pacific Theater, the man who had access to everything Boyington supposedly knew, making the pilot's continued interrogation completely unnecessary. How long? Boyington asked. 6 months. Since his capture during the Helena incident. We convinced his family that he was dead, then offered him a choice, cooperation or the revelation that he was collaborating with the enemy. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Henderson hadn't died with his ship, he'd been captured, turned, and used as a source of high-level intelligence while his family mourned his heroic death. Every mission he'd compromised, every operation he'd betrayed, every American who died because of information he'd provided, all of it hidden behind the fiction of his noble sacrifice. The 47 prisoners, Boyington said. Henderson told you to keep them alive as leverage. Yes. Insurance against exactly this type of situation. The transport planes were closer now, their engines growing louder as they approached the drop zone. In perhaps 10 minutes, 200 American paratroopers would begin their descent into what they believed was a rescue operation but was actually an elaborate trap designed to capture or kill the most elite soldiers in the Pacific Theater. Major, I need that radio contact now, Yamamoto said urgently. Whatever secrets you think you're protecting, they're not worth 47 American lives. Boyington looked up at the approaching aircraft and made his decision, not the decision Yamamoto expected. Not the decision his own command would have wanted, the decision that honor demanded, regardless of the cost. Lieutenant, he said calmly. I want to speak to Captain Henderson. 20 minutes later, Boyington found himself face to face with the men whose betrayal had cost dozens of American lives and compromised operations throughout the Pacific Theater. Henderson looked older than his 43 years, his face marked by the particular strain that came from living a lie so comprehensive it had consumed his entire identity. He wore a Japanese uniform but carried himself like the senior intelligence officer he'd once been. Hello, Pappy, Henderson said quietly. I suppose you figured it out. Most of it. You've been feeding intelligence to the Japanese while your family thinks you're dead. You've got 47 American prisoners being held as leverage against exactly this kind of situation. And you've convinced Yamamoto that I possess operational secrets that are actually in your head. Henderson nodded slowly. The irony being that you actually do possess some of those secrets. Morrison's network, submarine communications, safe house locations, you know more than you realize. But not more than you know. No. Not more than I know. The transport planes were directly overhead now, beginning their final approach to the drop zone. In the distance, Boyington could see the first parachutes opening like deadly flowers against the dawn sky. Charles, Boyington said, using Henderson's first name deliberately. How many more Americans are going to die to protect your secret? As many as it takes, Henderson replied. Because the alternative is worse. If the Japanese reveal that I've been collaborating, if they expose the scope of what I've provided them, it won't just destroy my family. It will compromise every intelligence operation in the Pacific. Hundreds of agents, thousands of local sympathizers, entire resistance networks, all of them will be rolled up and executed. Henderson's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. I chose to sacrifice my honor to save lives, Pappy. The same choice you're facing now. Cooperate with the enemy to protect the people who matter most. It was a compelling argument. One man's reputation weighed against the lives of hundreds of Allied personnel. Individual honor measured against collective survival, but Boyington had seen the cost of Henderson's choice. Rodriguez, Chen, Patterson, all dead because the intelligence officer's betrayal had compromised their escape. Morrison executed because Henderson had revealed the existence of his informal reconnaissance network. 12 Marines killed attempting a rescue mission that Henderson had betrayed before it began. How many, Charles? Boyington asked. How many Americans have died because of the information you've provided? Henderson's silence was answer enough. The first paratroopers were landing now, their chutes collapsing as they hit the ground and immediately came under fire from concealed Japanese positions. The assault was proceeding exactly as planned, except that the plan belonged to the enemy, not to Allied command. 200 of America's finest soldiers were about to be slaughtered in a trap that could have been avoided if one intelligence officer had chosen death over dishonor 6 months ago. The radio, Yamamoto said urgently, thrusting a microphone toward Boyington. Call them off now, or everyone dies. Boyington took the radio and stared at it for a long moment. One transmission could save the paratroopers, preserve the lives of 47 American prisoners, and protect Henderson's network of collaborators. All he had to do was tell his command that the situation was under control, that the assault was unnecessary. All he had to do was lie. Instead, he keyed the microphone and spoke 4 words that sealed the fate of everyone in the compound. Eagle Base, abort mission. But not for the reasons Yamamoto expected. Repeat, abort mission. Compound is a trap. Henderson is alive and collaborating. Prisoners are bait. Withdraw immediately. The response came back within seconds, crackling with static and disbelief. Pappy, confirm last transmission. Say again, Henderson status. Charles Henderson, captured 6 months ago, turned by enemy intelligence. Current location this facility. 47 prisoners held as leverage. Mission is compromised. Abort. Yamamoto lunged for the radio, but Boyington was ready for him. Despite his injuries, despite his exhaustion, the pilot still had enough strength to fight for the 30 seconds it took to complete his transmission. Morrison's intelligence confirms Japanese war crimes. 312 missing personnel still alive in various facilities. Evidence must reach War Crimes Commission. Boyington out. The radio died as Yamamoto finally wrestled it away, but the damage was done. Allied command now knew the truth about Henderson's betrayal, about the systematic concealment of American prisoners, about the elaborate deception that had cost so many lives, the truth that would expose Japanese war crimes and save hundreds of families from false grief, the truth that was worth any sacrifice, even as the compound erupted into chaos around him, even as Japanese guards began executing prisoners in preparation for their final stand, even as Henderson stared at him with the hollow eyes of a man whose deepest secret had just been revealed to the world. Major Gregory Pappy Boyington felt something he hadn't experienced in months. He had kept his promise to Morrison. He had protected the intelligence that mattered most. He had chosen honor over survival, truth over comfort, duty over life itself. The last thing he saw before the bullets found him was the American flag on a paratrooper's shoulder, visible through the window as Allied forces fought their way into the compound, the flag he had served and died for, and would never see again. But 47 American families would learn that their loved ones were still alive. 312 names would be investigated and verified, and the truth about Japanese war crimes would survive, even if the men who died protecting it did not. Sometimes that was enough, sometimes that was everything. Epilogue: Captain Henderson was repatriated after the war and quietly court-martialed for collaboration with the enemy. He served 8 years in military prison before dying of a heart attack in 1953. His family never learned the truth about his capture and betrayal. The Morrison files, as they came to be known, led to the liberation of 847 American servicemen from secret Japanese prison facilities and resulted in war crimes prosecutions that continued into the 1950s. Major Gregory Pappy Boyington was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during captivity. His body was never recovered, but his silence had spoken louder than words.